Hi, Beach Church. It's that time again for another tidbit from Liz. Happy New Year to you guys. I hope that you had a wonderful holiday season. Today I'm going to teach you about Genesis. And there's so much in this that it was really hard to kind of break it down into 15 minutes. So I'm going to try my best to stay on track. But the ideas in here, there's so much to unpack if you're a dork like me. So I'm going to give it to you like this. The background of this is a lot deeper than the little section I'm going to give you. But right off the top, I just want to say two big pieces that a lot of preaching around Lot and Abraham and everybody seems to hit is like Abraham is righteous because, he gave Lot the choice. But there's like this small misnomer that a lot of people really don't know. And there's a background where when Abraham goes to Egypt, he lies to Pharaoh, says his wife is his sister, and then like trades her. And I just want to put that out there because you're going to hear a different side of Abraham. And everybody talks about how righteous Abraham is, but he's not the promised seed. No more than Adam was the promised seed, or Seth was the promised seed, or Moses was the promised seed, or Noah was the promised seed, or now you're going to hear about Abram and so on and so forth. Jesus is the promised seed. He was the one where all of the lineage was to be redeemed. So Abraham is no more righteous than Lot. And I want to make that really clear because he's flawed. And if you think it's transactional where you can do this and you make these right choices and then God's going to bless you, that's not how it is with relationship. You make mistakes, but with relationship, God still equips you and gives you exceedingly and abundantly above all that you ask. So that's a little bit of nerdy nugget in there. And the other side of it is there's this whole piece where Abram and Sarah kind of like are childless, and everybody knows that story, or at least a lot of people that have heard preaching on it. And they kind of step outside of God's will and have Ishmael. And there is not really this talk about how the Egyptian, was a slave. So there probably really wasn't consent to Hagar, and it was just expected. And I find it funny that the covenant he makes later is circumcision, and the idea between castration and circumcision and the idea of it is like sometimes we throw everything out like the baby in the bathwater instead of sitting in the balance of the uncomfortable and having to circumcise something in our lives, sitting in that waiting with something that's uncomfortable. One of my clients was struggling with porn, and so he threw his whole laptop out and then he needed it. And that's kind of like castration. But to be able to keep it and deal with that struggle of temptation, that's what God is doing with the covenant with Abraham and the circumcision piece to it. And I think there is some relevance to it to tie it back to, how the slave, this beautiful Egyptian slave, was violated. Anyway, those are my two nerdy nuggets. I hope some of that made sense. If not, please actually read the context of this story, because what I'm going to give you isn't going to cover these two big things where one, Abraham isn't this huge pious person, and he's like you and me. He makes mistakes, and he was abundantly blessed. So now I'm going to pick up our story and talk to you about 13 through 15. So before we jump in, I want you to take a breath with me, because it's not really a loud passage. It's a quiet wrestling passage. And I say that because there's a struggle inside. And if you're tired in the waiting or trying to hold things together while trusting God at the same time, this message is for you to believe beyond what you're feeling in that waiting. So when letting go feels very risky and unsafe, that's how I titled the synopsis of chapter 13, When Letting Go Feels Risky. Abram and Lot are both so abundantly blessed, but blessing brings tension, right? Their two camps are starting to butt heads, and so there's not enough land and there's not enough space, and something has to give, right? So Abram looks at Lot and he was like, hey, basically, you choose first. You choose. And I want you to sit with that. Like when there's tension between you and someone else, do you let them make the choice or do you try to control it? You know, a little nerdy nugget here is in Abram's world, the older, more powerful man, right? He would have chose first. Letting Lot choose wasn't weakness. It was faith in God. Abram wasn't trusting in the land and what he saw in the abundance. He was trusting in God who made the promise to him. So you have to really be introspective here for a second and think, like Abraham, what am I holding tightly right now because I'm afraid of losing it or accepting I've lost it? What am I holding on to tightly right now because I'm afraid of losing it? What would it look like not to abandon it, but to release control and trust God with the outcome? Abram lets go, and then God speaks. So in Genesis 13, you'll see that God speaks after he releases his control, like his idea of what shoulda, coulda, woulda happened if only, right? God says, lift up your eyes. See all that land, all that I'm going to give you. And God waits until Lot leaves before he reaffirms this promise to Abraham. There's something to that. Sometimes God waits until our hands are open, not to punish us, but because we can finally receive. Like when the burden and the stress of the person after we've been obedient is out of the way, then our hands and hearts are open, and so God speaks to us. So then, chapter 14, right? It's going to come along, and faith that steps in, not away. I think it takes a lot to think that way, to take each piece of this section accountable. So what you're going to see is like Lot is taken captive, right? Because he eventually chose Sodom, land that looked really fruitful, right? But Abram doesn't say, well, you know what? You chose the more promising land. You made your bed. You're going to lie in it. Nah. Actually, what he does is come in with all new bedding and a blanket. He goes after him. Faith doesn't mean avoidance. Faith means showing up sometimes when you're tired, sometimes afraid, but willing. Sometimes even when you're angry with God, but you still show up. Or maybe you're angry with another person, but you should still show up with them. So another nerdy nugget I think here is Melchizedek is like this king of Sodom, right? And so Abram refuses the king of Sodom's wealth afterward. And, you know, my nerdy self was like, well, why would he do that, right? Because Abram doesn't want the world to say, oh, well, we made you successful. Like the king could take credit, right? He knows where his provision comes from. And it can only be a miracle at this point for him to get in and out of Sodom and Gomorrah with his life. And by the way, his cousin. And there's a whole other sermon in the way he gets the grace and mercy from God because he's negotiating with the creator of the universe. Sidebar, in case somebody believes there isn't grace and mercy in the Old Testament, revisit this discussion between Abram and God the creator. Just saying. So with that, I say to you, you know, what gets credit for your sense of worth right now? Is it your work? Is it your marriage? Is it your bank account, your bills being paid, your role, your stature, your productivity? Or is it God alone? If nobody sees but God, does he get credit? He knows your struggle. He knows how you've been waiting. He knows that you're tired and isolated. He knows that it's been heavy to carry. And he's with you in that waiting. So then we're going to jump into 15. When faith asks really hard questions, right? 15 begins real tenderly. So God says, don't be afraid, Abram. I'm your shield. And Abram answers honestly. This is what I was talking about before. He's honest. He's just like you and I. He says, well, what can you give me? I'm still childless. And this is not disrespect. That's the key that you got to understand. This is relationship. This is what relationships are like. That you can ask hard questions of each other and you can be vulnerable through your hurt, through your anger. You can give each other permission to lament. You know, a nerdy nugget for back then and now in Hebrew scripture, questioning God wasn't sinful. It was faithful. Because they believed that they would hear, that there would be a dialogue. All of us, in one way or another, can often in prayer monologue to God. But, is there a dialogue where you have faith enough to hear his voice come back to you? You see, Abraham isn't doubting God. Abraham is struggling with the waiting for the windfall, the provision, the isolation to go away, the gift of the obedience to be fulfilled. But God doesn't shut him down in the question. He invites him outside. He's like, hey, come here. Let me holler at you. And he's like, hey, you see these stars up here? Look at these stars. So before he tells him, look at all the land, right? Now he's like, hey, you need to look at all these stars. For as many stars as you see, that's as many as I'm going to number your generations. Like, can you even fathom that? I can't count all the stars, even in a wonderful Virginia mountain kind of beautiful skylit night away from light pollution. I can't imagine knowing all of those stars would represent my children and my children's children and my generations. Like, doesn't get any bigger. I'm pretty sure that's like the biggest blessing in the Bible. So Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Abram didn't credit it to him or his hard labor, him being a good husband or any of that. He humbled himself. You see, belief here doesn't mean certainty. It means trusting God in the dark, in the isolation, in the low bank account moments, in the valley of death, in the seeds of panic attacks, when fear hit you and you're crippled. This happens, by the way, all before the law and rules or performance. Righteousness comes from trust, not perfection. That's why I told you that about Abraham. You don't have to get it all right. You just have to stay tuned towards God daily. He's most glorified in these daily little simple acts, not these big grand gestures for others to see. So then he makes a covenant, right? And God carries the weight with this. The way it used to be was like we walk in a covenant, we both agree, but if I break the covenant, then I'm responsible for the consequences. That's literally how it is. You make a vow when you get married to each other, but you are also making a covenant to God, right? So God makes a covenant. And through that covenant, Abraham doesn't walk through the pieces of that covenant, but God does. And he does it alone. So even though Abram breaks from it, makes these mistakes, God takes those moments, all of his mistakes, all of his failures, and his consequences. So it's like God is saying, if this promise breaks, I take the cost. And one day he does. And I'm so thankful that he did. So where are you standing in the in-between right now, where you are low in faith? Maybe because you feel alone all the time and you're isolated and you're tired of all the rejection and the abandonment. God sees it. Maybe it's the fear of ever being able to get ahead in your career or being noticed. Or maybe it's when you have, less money in your bank account than you do bills. Or maybe it's communication issues between you and someone you love. Well, I want you to think about that. Where are you standing in the in-between right now? Between your prayer and your answer. Between your grief and your healing. Between your obedience and the clarity. God doesn't rush Abram, and he's not going to rush you either. He's not rushing you. Take your time, breathe. He says, I'm your shield. He says, I see you, even in the dark, even here, trust me. So that's it, guys. That's another tidbit from Liz. To remember that God is so holy and he is sovereign above everything on this earth. To try to reframe, what the scripture said back then so we can understand it and live it now. That's my goal. So that the grace and peace of God would be with all of us. I love you all and I miss you, and I hope that January comes in and out and brings much needed relief and rest in this dormant season of winter.